Welcome to Vendée Radio. Tonight I am rejoined by Dr. Alan Fimister, who recently appeared on this program to discuss the Catholic history of England. And in that first broadcast, he covered Albion's legendary beginnings, Roman Britain and Anglo-Saxon England, the Anglo-Saxon period, which gave us a litany of saints, many of our foundational institutions, the shires, the city burghs, the code of law, and culminated in the reign of Saint Edward the Confessor, what Joseph Pearce has called a supernova, the star most splendid just as it was about to collapse. And Dr. Fimister is an assistant professor of theology at St. John Vianney Theological Seminary in Denver, Colorado, and is director of the Dialogos Institute, and is also the co-author of the book Integralism, a Manual of Political Philosophy. Dr. Fimister, welcome back to Vendée Radio.
Hello, thank you very much for having me on again.
Well, it was a great pleasure last time, and fascinating to review the mythic origins of England and to understand more deeply how the church was the essential catalyst in the making of the gens Anglorum, the people of the English, and to hear more about the heroic age in world affairs of the Anglo-Saxon missions. So it'd be great to take up the story in the late Anglo-Saxon period, as England is recognizably a nation.
Yes, I was saying to you before we came on air that I have a bit of a disclaimer to make, which is that when I first began my undergraduate studies in history, we were given a choice to do either Anglo-Saxon England or Norman and Plantagenet England, and I, for good or ill, I still think basically good, I chose to do Anglo-Saxon England. So my knowledge gets sketchier the nearer we get to 1066, but and much sketchier afterwards. But yeah, I mean, I've always been of the, at least for a long time, I've been of the opinion that the kind of crucial, well, there's two crucial, well, I shouldn't say what the second one is. The first of the two crucial moments in setting England on the wrong path that leads us to the monster, the spot of blood and grease on the history of England that is Henry VIII, is the murder of Edward the Martyr on the 18th of March 978, because one of the striking things about England as a kingdom in the first century of its existence is the way the order and the piety and its success compared to the sort of anarchy engulfing much of the rest of Western Christendom. And one of the striking things about Edward the Martyr's father, his reign, Edgar the Peaceable, who died in 975, is his adoption of the ideals, the monastic ideals stemming from, most famously from Cluny, which was founded in 910, which become the mainstay of the Gregorian reform movement in the Western Church from the middle of the 11th century onwards. And Edgar is already, who I think is the great-great-grandson of Alfred, I have to go and check that, he's already applying these ideals to both the spiritual and the temporal order in a way that is going to become the defining feature of Christendom in the era just before the First Crusade. And he, in fact, in Father Thomas, in my book, Integralism, we mentioned that the earliest probable reference to the doctrine of the two swords, of the temporal and spiritual interpretation of the two swords at the Last Supper in Luke's Gospel is in a remark made by Edgar to St. Dunstan at Synod in the 970s. He talks about, I mean, it's not absolutely clear because he talks about now I'm trying to think. I think he says that Dunstan is wielding the sword of Peter and he is wielding the sword of Constantine. But the sword of Peter is clearly the sword of spiritual authority, and it seems plausible that he's thinking in terms of the two swords passage in Luke's Gospel, but who knows? But so I mean, it seems as if England is anticipating the sort of ideological engine of the revival of Latin Christendom that's going to take off so spectacularly in the 11th century. In the first part of the and the middle of the 10th century, and then after Edgar dies, there's in terms of the monasticization of the secular clergy in a certain sense, and because Saint Dunstan, Saint Ethelwold, and Saint Oswald, not the King of Northumbria, the bishop, are all abbots, and they all Benedictinize the cathedral chapters of their cathedrals when they're appointed to various eminent sees by Edgar. But then there's this, and I believe that was a distinctive feature of English ecclesiastical government up to the Reformation, that about half of the cathedral chapters were monastic communities, and that was very unusual compared to most of mainland Europe. At least I seem to remember that anyway. I was wondering whether that's why there isn't a Benedictine house in the diocese of Hexham and Newcastle. I wonder whether the bishops have always worried that they would acquire their pre-Reformation rights if such a community were ever established there, because the Diocese of Hexham is the only diocese which was re-established by Pius IX. All the other English dioceses were created under completely new titles. The only one that was the restoration of a pre-Reformation title was the Diocese of Hexham, which subsequently added and Newcastle. But Hexham had been the Diocese of Lindisfarne, founded by St Aidan, was bifurcated into the Diocese of Hexham and the Diocese of Lindisfarne, and then the two of them were subsequently reunited as the Diocese of Durham. So juridically, the Diocese of Hexham is really just the Diocese of Durham. So I have tried to argue to people from less blessed parts of England that this means that Hexham and Newcastle has precedence over all other dioceses in the country, but nobody outside of Hexham and Newcastle seems to be convinced by this argument. But anyway, so yes, so they monasticized their cathedral chapters, and the ideals of Cluny and other reform houses on the continent were being incorporated into a national system under Edgar. There's a famous document called the Regularis Concordia, which was trying to accomplish this. I think there's a lot of argument over exactly how important the document was. I believe Don David Knowles was very enthusiastic about it, and there was some tension in the English Benedictine congregation because it was seen as as furthering whatever his constitutional agenda was for the English Benedictine congregation, which I don't know what at all the arcane arguments about that were. But anyway, and then there's this massive reaction against the monastic reform movement in England with the death of Edgar, and Edgar leaves two sons by two different wives, due to legitimate sequence of wives, no funny business, and the younger is Ethelred the Unready, and the elder is Edward the Martyr, and he is assassinated by the opponents of the monastic reform movement. And as we talked about last time, I think the monastic nature of the creation of the English nation and the idea of the primacy of the contemplative, and that seek ye first the kingdom of God and his justice, and these other things shall be added unto ye. That is the essence of what the genius of Alfred, and in seeing what was so important about Augustine of Canterbury, and is the central argument of Bede as to why the English were permitted to take over Britannia. And it seems that the rejection of that involved in the martyrdom of Edward the Martyr, and the establishment of Ethelred the Unready instead on the throne somehow represents a turning away from that principle, which was swiftly followed by temporal retribution, as Alfred implied it would be. Because I mean, it's not just, you don't have to wait till 1066. I mean, Ethelred the Unready's reign is a litany of disasters, ending with the Danish conquest of the country. Does that convince you at all?
It very much does, and it's a part of English history which I'm sadly quite ignorant of, really, the Anglo-Saxon fluorescence. But I didn't know that there was that turn away at that early step. That's certainly quite suggestive. Would you, to go back to Alfred, would you endorse the cause for his canonization?
Well, I'm not sure that he needs to be canonized, because he was venerated as a saint in England in various monastic houses and other places before canonization was introduced. I think it's a late 10th century pope, in fact, who is when he canonizes Ulrich of Augsburg, is the first one to start the sort of papal process of canonization. And I believe Alfred's veneration was unbroken up to the Reformation, and so I would argue that there's no. Now I think you could counter argue that I think it Henry VI petitioned for Alfred to be canonized, and that was turned down. But the papal refusals are not infallible acts, and if Alfred didn't require the canonization in the first place, I don't think the fact that Henry VI asked for it compromises that argument. Poor old Henry VI, I think Henry VII tried to get him canonized, and Julius II is supposed to have said he had never considered stupidity a note of sanctity. Which is, well, I mean, yes, Julius II wasn't a very nice man anyway, but yeah, I think he probably is. I think it wouldn't. I mean, we'd have to see what would happen if the Bishop of Clifton or whoever it would be raises him to the Arundel and Brighton, adds him to the diocesan calendar, see how Rome responds. But I think I think there's an argument to be made that he doesn't require canonization.
Certainly, the far-sighted nature of his policy, his vision, is I think truly justifies his title as the father of the English nation.
Yes.
So we have the repulsion of the great heathen army and the Viking invasions, but there is the effort to evangelize them. And eventually that does bear fruit, but we still have eventually the Viking kings.
Oh, you mean Canute and Harder-Canute and all that lot?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely.
The early 11th.
I mean, in a way, they just raise the same, in terms of like asking what is the providential meaning of this. They raise in just a slightly less violent fashion the question which is raised by 1066, and I think it's very difficult to understand the answer to that question. I mean, the English are not the chosen people. consequently, what happens to the English is not doesn't tell you the meaning of divine providence in the new covenant. So, I mean, the Normans were going around knocking out regimes and establishing their own all over the whole peninsula of Europe through that period. So, I mean, you know, you could just, it's tempting to think of Anglo-Saxon England as sort of another bit of meaningless Norman roadkill on the course of their journey from Norway to Jerusalem. But obviously one doesn't want to see it that way. I mean, it's interesting that I don't know what the power politics of Edward the Confessor's reign. Of course, as you say, Ethelred fails in defending the Kingdom of England against Danish conquest. We have a sequence of Danish kings, and then more or less fortuitously, the junior branch of Alfred's line is restored to the throne in the person of Edward the Confessor, the senior branch being in exile in Hungary, and strangely enough, after the conquest, the Witan makes a brief attempt to place the senior branch on the throne, and then swiftly think better of it when William the Conqueror turns up looking murderous and unscrupulous. So Edgar Atheling ends up travelling up to Scotland, as far as we know, so he would have been the heir. As far as we know, he has no descendants. I understand it's not absolutely certain. It's an argument from absence. It's not absolutely certain he has no descendants, but one would think that we'd know about them if he did. And so on the sort of Salic rule, that would then mean, because he exhausts the known male line of the House of Wessex, so that would then transmit the House of Wessex to Saint Margaret, his sister, and she, of course, famously marries Malcolm III Canmore, the King of Scotland, who features in Macbeth, and not coincidentally, and Margaret names her children in sequence after her ancestors. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but the children of Malcolm III and Margaret are. I'm just going to try and find a list of them. Where have they gone? But they have these weirdly Anglo-Saxon names. So she's asserting the fact that the Scottish royal line is the royal line of England, as eloquently as she can. Let's have a look. Give us a list. Okay, issue. So it's Edmund. So Edward is the eldest, named after her father. Edmund, named after his father. Ethelred, named after his father. Edgar, named after his father, and then he gives up after she gives up after that. It's Alexander, Edith, Mary, and David after that. And I don't suppose the David is an allusion to any weird theories of James VI about the descent of the Stuarts. But anyway, he so strangely you have the Anglo-Saxon royal line continuing in Scotland, but in the reign of Edward the Confessor, it seems that he was not entirely in command of the English nobility, and particularly Godwin and his son Harold Godwinson. They behaved quite outrageously in a number of areas, and including murdering Margaret's father, probably being responsible for the murder of Margaret's father anyway, so it's not. I mean, I don't. One of the arguments which seem to have been made by William the Conqueror in favour of papal backing for Norman Conquest was the situation of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stigand, who was a pluralist. I can't remember which see he was also holding at the same time. I think it might have been Winchester. He was holding Winchester at the same time as Canterbury, and usual account is that he was excommunicate at the point at which the conquest happened. But he didn't. It was the Archbishop of York who crowned William the Conqueror king, precisely because of the fact that Stigand was excommunicate. Of course, the other argument was that about Harold's oath on holy relics to support William's candidacy for the English throne, which he was seen to have violated by having accepted the throne himself. I certainly, when I was an undergraduate, I remember talking to a very eminent medieval historian about these questions around the conquest, and he was of the view that that Edward the Confessor had actually offered the throne to Edgar on his death, not to Harold, and that the Witan, knowing that Harold Hardrada and William of Normandy were both planning to invade and stake claims, and also that Harold Godwinson was overwhelmingly the most powerful magnate in the realm and might well try and seize the throne for himself regardless, that the Witan ignored Edward the Confessor's wishes and offered the throne to Harold instead, which he then accepted, which would make it particularly striking because, of course, it might be then that had Harold been a good boy and accepted the rightful heir to the throne as the king and just fought for him at Hastings instead of fought on his own behalf, perhaps Providence would have delivered Anglo-Saxon England from demolition by the Normans. But that's obviously completely unknowable speculation. So obviously the reason why the Holy See was unhappy with the Archbishop of Canterbury was because of this monastic reform movement, which from 1049 had taken control of the Holy See. They weren't willing to accept things like pluralism, and so the toleration by the Anglo-Saxons of this situation is symptomatic of their having turned their backs on the reform movement itself, which again takes us back to the assassination of Edward the Martyr. So yeah, I mean, as the Oracle says in The Matrix, you never see past the decisions you don't understand. I'm not advocating the Matrix films particularly, but I think the 1066 is an enormous conundrum. I mean, it does. I mean, it seems to me from a cultural point of view, England would have been a much more parochial place had we not been conquered by the Normans. I mean, we've been like a sort of Scandinavian country, sort of interesting. The trains run on time. Everything's terribly clean. They're very polite to you. They seem to have an alcohol problem, and everything's massively overpriced. And that's it. That would be all that anyone cared about the place. Whereas it seems that we were wrenched into the mainstream of Latin Christendom by incorporation into the Norman world. So no doubt God had purposes for us in that mainstream, and I think we as I say deserved our fate to a certain degree due to those various crimes which I mentioned that preceded the conquest. So perhaps that provides something like an adequate explanation, but I don't know what you think.
No, indeed. So we have the Norman Conquest, which, as you say, represents the most significant break in national life alongside the Protestant Revolution in the 1530s and the almost total replacement of the English elite and this estrangement between the Norman elite and the Saxon folk, at least for several generations. And we as Catholics, we have to consider the papal permission to intervene in 1066. And I think it takes, as I say, many decades for this rift for the new elite to be integrated, shall we say, into English society. I mean, there are different accounts of how long that takes and so on. But to this day, there are claims that the Anglo-Saxon spirit is still present in a kind of predominant form in the English working class, and Robin Hood is obviously a folk hero that embodies that national spirit. And people say something like, John Pym, the parliamentary revolutionary, was from Huntingdonshire, was a descendant of one of the few Saxon nobility that has survived. So the Saxon cause is kind of taken up by those on the revolutionary left as well. It seems to.
Well, I think two caveats to that. One is that that we don't know how Saxon/Angle the population really was in 1066, because of course, I mean they, as I think I mentioned last time, there's no surviving Anglo-Saxon folk culture. I mean, so there are no stories that have survived orally. We've got Beowulf, but that was found in a manuscript, and it seems, I think, as far as I understand it, that genetics show that the population, that all the invading populations, the Normans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, made a minor impact on the population, nowhere more than 25%. And that's the very limit of 25% of all invading populations combined. What was the other point you were making there? You listed a number of points. There was something else that I wanted to say something about. But
about the enduring mythos of the sort of Anglo-Saxon spirit is.
Oh yes, and Robin Hood. Yeah, I mean, as I understand it, all the medieval Robin Hood. I might be wrong here, but I think all the medieval Robin Hood ballads and fragments, none of them mention the Norman yoke. That is a post-Reformation innovation, which becomes more and more prominent in the recounting of Robin Hood stories. But he's not seen as a sort of Anglo-Saxon resistance fighter in the original texts. I'm told, again, I don't know this for certain, that the first English king to certainly speak English after the conquest was Edward I.
Yep.
Amazing. I mean, that's is he the 11th king or something after the conquest? But that's a very long time. And I was arguing with an Irish American at a party about 2 years ago, and I've forgotten what his surname was. It was something like Martin or something, and he was saying how much he didn't like the English because they're such wicked people. They'd oppressed the Irish so badly over all these years, and I think it turned out, when I sort of asked a few more questions, that actually had quite substantial English ancestry, possibly larger than his Irish ancestry. But he chose to identify with the Irish as the victims of wicked English oppression. And I pointed out to him that the people who invaded Ireland in the 12th century didn't speak English. They were Norman French speakers, and my surname is Anglo-Saxon, whereas his surname is a Norman surname. And so he's probably descended from them, whereas I'm descended from another group of innocent oppressees of the Normans. So really, it's all the other way around.
Yes.
Didn't like that at all. Yes, the flag, the banner. It's very interesting that Pope Alexander II sends to William of Normandy. It's very interesting because there is a depiction of it, which is hard to really tell what to make of, because it's by a tapestry. But and if that depiction of it is correct, and it doesn't come across to me as if it's intended to be an accurate depiction. I think it's just intended to be a symbolic banner that's being handed over. But if it's correct, then it's disappeared into the mists of antiquity, and we've no idea of what it really looked like, and it's gone. But it's very striking that Alexander II was Milanese, and he was heavily involved in an angry lay movement in Milan against simoniacal and pluralist clerics, and they. He'd been sent off, I think, was he Bishop of Lucca or something before he became Pope, and but he was still in touch with his old friends from that period, and he was promoting their cause once he became Pope, and I think there's a Saint Erabaldo, I think his name is, who was the leader of this group in Milan, and he was assassinated. And again, it's another anti-Gregorian reform movement assassination, because I mean he was part of this same movement, and he. But at one point, Alexander II sent a banner to the Milanese Gregorian reformers, and which is described in the sources as the banner of the Roman Church, which is what the banner that was sent to William the Conqueror is also described as, and that banner remains to this day the coat of arms of the city of Milan, and it is a red horizontal cross on a white background.
Mm-hmm.
So there's the circumstantial evidence to suggest that the banner that William the Conqueror was sent, and in fact, not only that, but the banner that was sent to Milan was sent also in 1066. So it was in exactly the same year as well. So the circumstantial evidence to suggest that the reason why a horizontal cross on a red cross on a white background is associated with England is because that was the banner that was given to William the Conqueror. So I don't know if that improves things or worsens them.
Well, it seems to deepen the papal genesis of the English nation.
Yes, absolutely,
as a theme. So I don't know if you're familiar with the writings of Eadmer, an Anglo-Saxon ecclesiastic at the time of, or just after the conquest. But he recorded how Langfranc, the Norman Archbishop of Canterbury, suppressed the celebration of the Immaculate Conception, which had actually been begun before the Norman Conquest, when England's king was a saint. He wrote, in former days it was celebrated more commonly than now, and by those chiefly in whom there dwelt a pure simplicity of soul and a humble devotion. And thus those, in virtue of their position of authority, did not scruple to abolish what the simple and perfect love of Our Lady had established, namely the feast of her conception. Having thus seen the mode of proceeding of the eminent persons who succeeded in doing away with the feast of the Mother of God, let us cast a glance at the love of the simple folk who lament over the loss of so great a gladness. So I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on the effect of the Norman Conquest on the church in England, of the character and shape of the church in England.
Well, I mean, it's hard to... I know many years ago I was attending a conference of the Historical Association in Durham many years ago. I think it was 1993. And we had there was a very interesting paper given by a historian from Durham University, quite a skeptical non-Christian historian, who was studying the clearing out of the monastic community at Durham after the conquest and their replacement with Norman Benedictines. There's a work called Simeon's History of the Church at Durham, which originally described exactly what had happened here. I mean, the work goes back. It was written, I think, in the 1080s or something. The work goes back to St. Cuthbert and the entire history of the church in Durham, and describes the peregrinations of St. Cuthbert's body from Lindisfarne to Durham, and then he does get on to describing what happened when the Normans came and did whatever it is they did to whatever the monastic community was that was in Durham, and that this is all contested at the time of the conquest. And somebody later on, I don't know if it was in his time or later on, scoured this out. I don't know if it's because it's damaged the claims to continuity of the monastic community in Durham. But they scraped it off, and the historian who was giving the paper, he showed us these slides of all the kind of gamma rays and whatever he'd fired at this manuscript in order to try and work out what it originally said. But the Norman editors were too ruthless and thorough, as is their wont in all areas of life, and they managed to remove any trace of it whatsoever. So you never find out. But I mean, I would assume that this means that the community that was there was pretty much dissolved because of the fact, because otherwise why would they want to get rid of this passage so determinedly? And the following day we were given a tour of the Cathedral Library at Durham, and the librarians had left out a number of books for us to have a look at. And I wandered over to one side of the room and I picked up one of these books and I was flicking through it. And then to my horror, I realized that I was looking at the page that had been scoured out, that we'd been hearing about the day before. And then I was holding an almost 1,000-year-old book in my hands. And I began to shake at that point, so I put it down. But yeah, I think that's the clergy were replaced, the elite, the temporal elite were replaced across England. That the story of Durham was repeated in innumerable different places, and yeah, it was a kind of year zero in many respects. And I mean, there's no getting around that. I think you were saying before we began talking officially that Belloc, how's it? What was it you said? The words you said, that England was founded on a hill in
Sussex. Yes.
In
what we know as England was founded on a hill in Sussex.
And yeah, I think Jack Straw, the then Foreign Secretary, who's famously I think he said at one point how shocked he was. This was before he was Foreign Secretary. He said how shocked he was that so many people were studying medieval history in England, and what a waste of money that was. So yeah, doesn't have a special place in my heart, I'm afraid. But he during the debates in the UN Security Council over the invasion of Iraq at the beginning of this century, Jacques Chirac gave a speech in which he was opposing the invasion of Iraq, and he protested against the disrespect with which he felt the French government had been treated by the Bush administration, and he said that he represented a very ancient country which was not used to being treated in such a cavalier fashion, and when Jack Straw came to speak, he said that he represented a country founded in 1066 by the French. He said, which I thought was quite funny. I mean, I don't know what sort of on what basis the United Kingdom could said to have been founded by the French in 1066. Although our regnal numbering is based on the Norman kings, we don't. Yeah. Edward the Martyr is precisely Edward the Martyr because he's not Edward the. Would he be Edward the Second? Wouldn't he? If you numbered from Alfred, because there's Edward the Elder, Edward the Martyr, and Edward.
Yes.
So I suppose the numbering gives away the secret that we really are the Norman state.
And yet the French still call us the Anglo-Saxons, and in all the Anglophone countries, the Anglo-Saxon nations.
Yes, I was just watching a clip from an interview that the Spectator just did with this populist candidate in the French presidential elections who they're all getting worried about. And he resolutely refers to us as the Anglais throughout the entire, and to the United Kingdom as Angleterre throughout the entire interview. There's no concession to the Britishness of the UK. There's I remember when I was walking to Santiago, it was absolutely impossible to get, they would ask you when you went to the hostels what country you were from. And I was at Aberdeen, but obviously I'm not Scottish. So they understood Scottish and they understood English, but you had to say what country you were from. And so I would say that I was from Britannia, but they were absolutely not up for this. They were just Inglaterra, and there was no way of explaining it. So yes, but yeah. So it's I mean, yeah. There's no way. I mean, the coat of arms of England, the three lions, they are representative of Normandy and Aquitaine. The first time they were adopted was by Richard the Lionheart, and the coat of arms of Aquitaine, his mother's duchy, was a single golden lion on a red background, and obviously the coat of arms of Normandy, his father's duchy, supposedly, was two golden lions on a red background. So he just combined them. So the coat of arms of England represents Normandy and Aquitaine, and the flag of England represents the righteousness of the cause of William the Conqueror. So it's hardwired into the English identity. 80% of the words in the English language are of Latin origin, almost always via French. I mean, not in ordinary use, but if you actually just list them all and check where they're from. But again, if the base population are actually Welsh, then that might partly explain why the language was able to become so completely flooded. I don't know if I mentioned last time this book called Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue. Did I mention this book?
No.
So it argues that the construction of modern English is very similar to Welsh. So the argument is that essentially the English population are as if a bunch of Spanish speakers took over the United States, as is not entirely impossible in the near future, and there eventually ended up being so many of them that they still needed to use English because it was the official language. But there were so many of them for whom Spanish was their first language that they would speak Spanglish to each other all the time, and Spanish constructions and Spanishisms would appear all over the place in the English that was used in the United States in the 23rd century. And the reason for this is that the people actually speaking it, as it were, their hearts were still speaking Spanish. So the argument of this book is that the hearts of the English population were still speaking Welsh, and that's where apparently the word "do" in English does very odd things, which are not done in other languages other than Welsh. And this is a sign. Like, are you doing the dishes? And no, that's not a good example. I can't. I'm not good enough linguist to give you to explain what the odd things that the word "do" and "doing" does in English, and how these resemble Welsh. But there we are. So I mean, in a way, I suppose the Anglo-Saxon elite, and are pushed down and mingled in with the post-Roman population that they were ruling over, and alike subjected to a Norman elite instead, who then export their Arthurian folklore back across to France to be written up by Chrétien de Troyes. So
yes, you have this gradual integration of the English nation following the Norman Conquest, and the diffusion of very important elements, as you say, of Latin Christendom, namely feudalism and the Gothic style later on. Also, since you mentioned Richard the Lionheart, the English participation in the Crusades. Could you elaborate a little bit on that and the eventual epic showdown with Saladin at the Battle of Arsuf?
Well, the interesting thing is a lot of Anglo-Saxons seem to have left England after the conquest and joined the Varangian Guard. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but
yes, New England in the Black Sea. Yes, there was a New London somewhere in Bulgaria or something.
Oh, wow, this all founded by Varangians. I didn't realise this. But yeah, Robert Guiscard, the Norman conqueror of southern Italy, and his son Bohemond, who's going to end up being one of the great heroes of the First Crusade, they before they got involved in crusading, they were trying to conquer the Byzantine Empire, which is why one of the many reasons the Byzantines were so unconstructively suspicious of the Crusaders when they arrived in 1096. But they apparently, in many of these battles, which Anna Komnena describes in her Alexiad, Anna Komnena is the daughter of the Byzantine emperor at the time of the Crusades, and she wrote a sort of a biography of her dad and how marvelous he was, called the Alexiad, and in which she skates over a few of the less edifying decisions made at the time of the Crusade. But she describes at great length his battles against Bohemond and Guiscard in the period before the Crusades, and I think a lot of those battles were kind of rematches of Hastings, because the Varangians were overwhelmingly dominated by Anglo-Saxons at that point. Although they were originally, I think they were originally Vikings from Rus, who originally had the Varangian Guard, but it just became a sort of Germanic diaspora, sort of French Foreign Legion type outfit. One of the principal leaders of the First Crusade was William the Conqueror's eldest son, Robert Curthose, who was responsible for the name of my hometown, Newcastle, because he rebuilt a Newcastle in the course of the Norman depredations in the north of England, on the remains of Hadrian's fortress of Pons Aelius, which is the old castle, and he had been cheated out of England for some reason, the complicated reasons. It was given to his homosexual, devil-worshipping younger brother, William II, and then Henry I managed to snaffle it. Poor old Curthose had several attempts at getting it back, and it never succeeded. The English also turned up with provisions, horses and timber and all sorts of things at various crucial moments during the First Crusade. During the siege of Antioch, which nearly went very badly wrong on a number of occasions. There was an English fleet arrived on the coast with provisions at a crucial moment, and when the Crusaders finally arrived at Jerusalem in June 1099, they had not taken into account the fact that there were no trees growing in the vicinity of Jerusalem, so the construction of siege engines was going to be rather difficult. And then the English turned up with loads of timber, which is nice, so perhaps Jerusalem would never have fallen were it not for the resourcefulness of the English. Yes, Robert of Normandy was one of those who captured Jerusalem, and he distinguished himself in the Battle of Ascalon shortly thereafter. Obviously, the most dominating English, in inverted commas, because again, he may well not have spoken English, figure in the Crusades is Richard the Lionheart in the Third Crusade. And I think Richard's role in the First Crusade is, well, Richard was 6'7", I believe. And I think Gibbon describes him as a god of war, and I think that was kind of how people encountered him when they met him. And of course, the Crusade would have been dominated by Frederick Barbarossa, but he died in peculiar circumstances in Anatolia on his way down. Possibly had a stroke and fell into a river on his way down, which rather took the wind out of the German contingent. And Richard was so impressive that Philip II, French king, decided to just go home shortly after the capture of Acre because he didn't want to be being constantly upstaged by the King of England. And he, on a number of occasions during the Third Crusade, Richard just charged into the enemy wielding an axe and was so terrifying in battle that they just fled. And there's even one occasion when Saladin was screaming at his men to attack the obviously exposed Lionheart, but he was just seen as so superhuman that they weren't willing to risk themselves against him. So I mean, he's quite the figure, and I mean, people are very rude about him, and there's always attempts to try and claim that he's homosexual. I believe they're all completely, of course, the category of homosexual is made up, modern thing, but. That he was that he had on occasion succumbed to unnatural vice, but there's no I mean, I don't think there's any conclusive evidence in favour of that. I think that's just a product of the modern zeal to discover such things in every possible historical location. And it seems that he was determined to return and complete the Third Crusade, or lead the Fourth Crusade, which in the end went so badly wrong, to Jerusalem. But he was killed in a random crossbow bolt while trying to recover the land stolen from him sacrilegiously in his absence by Philip II. So I think the second of those two moments, I think, those two terrible moments which have determined the spiritual course of England in some ways. The first is the murder of Edward the Martyr. I think the second is when Richard the Lionheart refuses to look at Jerusalem, because he's clearly unstoppable, and the Saracens are terrified of him. And as the crusading army approached Jerusalem, many people fled. And Saladin himself did not want to get caught in Jerusalem, and I think he's supposed to have been seen weeping over the inevitable reconquest of Jerusalem by Richard the Lionheart, which would obliterate the greatest achievement of his life, that is Saladin's life. And Richard's calculation was that because of the dissipation of the German Crusaders and the disappearance of the King of France, and because of the fact that many of the people there were not planning to remain in the Holy Land after the Crusade, he only had sufficient resources to hand to garrison the ports which he had reconquered in the opening phase of the Crusade, and that if he were to capture Jerusalem, which I don't think he doubted he would be able to do, he would have to move almost everybody garrisoning those ports to Jerusalem to defend it. And what the result of that would be that the ports would be captured by the Saracens again, and Jerusalem would be cut off, and would be unable to, and there'd be no chance for a relief force arriving to lift the siege until it was too late. And thereby both the coastline and Jerusalem would be lost to the Crusaders, and that would be the end of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so so his strategic calculation, because the amazing thing about the Lionheart was that he was this superhuman warrior and also an utterly brilliant strategist at the same time. And his calculation was that he couldn't, in conscience, lead an assault on Jerusalem, knowing that it would mean the destruction of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And but you know, in stylish chivalric fashion, he offered to resign as the commander of the army and serve as an ordinary soldier in somebody else's assault on Jerusalem, because he too wished with all his heart and soul to reconquer Jerusalem. He just couldn't. So he could obey orders and conquer Jerusalem, but he couldn't give orders and conquer Jerusalem. And they all wept, and he wept, and they turned down his offer, and they gloomily marched away from the holy city. And I mean, I think the reason why I think this is a terrible turning point is not because I think that Richard is a bad man, like the murderers of Edward the Martyr, but because I think that the reason why the First Crusade succeeded was a very strange combination of totally unpredictable zeal, piety, and trust in divine providence, and ruthless efficiency and military brilliance, and both of those were essential, because there are many moments during the First Crusade when, rationally speaking, they should have just turned back because it was completely doomed. And of course, one of the most terrible of those moments is when Stephen of Blois, whose son ends up usurping the throne of Matilda, he abandons the crusade at Antioch when he thinks they're certainly doomed, and he encounters the Byzantine Emperor Alexius Comnenus, who Blessed Urban II always intended to be the leader of the crusade, had finally decided he would go and lead the crusade, and he'd marched across Anatolia with an army, and he was on his way to rescue the Crusaders at the gates of Antioch, and then presumably lead them into Jerusalem, which probably would have meant that the Great Schism would have been, no one would have heard of it. It would have been an obscure episode in Latin Byzantine politics in the 11th century that was absorbed in the euphoria of the victory of the First Crusade. But he encountered Stephen of Blois, who was terribly embarrassed that Alexius was going off to try and rescue his comrades who he just abandoned. And Stephen of Blois told him that they were certainly dead, and that if Alexius went to rescue them, he would die with them. And Alexius turned back. I mean, that is one of the most awful, fateful moments in the whole of Byzantine history. So, I mean, it seems to me that that Richard was wrong. I can't give a rational account of why he was wrong, because I think doing it just because it was the right thing to do, Polish style, even though it's military suicide, seems to be, you know, was what was needed at that moment. And it's almost it always makes me think of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, the refusal to look at Jerusalem. In a certain sense. I mean, of course, again, I think from a Catholic point of view, Catholics in the US who are faithful to the teaching of Leo XIII and Pius IX rightly see the First Amendment as a provisional arrangement in a religiously mixed society that doesn't stand in the way of one day the United States being converted to Catholicism and becoming a consecrated part of Christendom. But in the end, it's eaten away in the form of Americanism at the at the zeal for the socialization of Christ of Catholics in the US and done immense harm to the US church, to the point where in 1950 it was imaginable the US might be a Catholic majority country, whereas it's very difficult to imagine that in 2021. And in a way that almost feels, probably this is because I'm teaching at a seminary in the United States, so I think about these things more than what I might do if I was living in England, but that seems almost like as if Richard the Lionheart's decision, perfectly sensibly, to provisionally not look at Jerusalem, go back and get a bigger army, and then come back and liberate it in a more sensible fashion. It almost seems like the same decision. Again, difficult to criticize. There's no way of giving an argument really as to why he was wrong. But I think that might be the moment at which pragmatism entered the English soul. Albeit the king who didn't speak English. Well,
seek first the kingdom of heaven.
Yes.
Abandonment to divine providence.
Yes. And these other things will be added unto you. Yeah.
And Richard is famously captured on his return. But by the way, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that the city of Portsmouth's seal is an overturned crescent. And the reason being is that was the embarkation point for the English armies for the Third Crusades. And they were returned with the captured Saracen banners. And that became the seal of the city. It's not a fact that you hear about on the BBC today.
Well, you know, the Second Crusade, which was generally a complete mess and didn't achieve anything, the English, it was triggered by the capture of Edessa, which was rightly seen as very threatening to the Crusader states. And the English Crusaders embarked by sea and stopped off in Iberia on their way there, and were persuaded by the locals to liberate Lisbon from the Moors, which they successfully did. And then a number of them carried on, a number of them stayed in Lisbon. The ancient alliance between England and Portugal actually goes back to a crusading action on the part of English crusaders, which gave them their capital. That's
incredible. I didn't know that.
It's quite fun. Yeah. I've never been to Lisbon. I shall try and see if I can get some free drinks out of that, if I ever manage to go there.
Yes, it's a brotherhood formed on the battlefield.
Yes.
And Portugal, alongside Spain, was in a sense the incarnation of Christian chivalry, a Christian nation forged in crusade, and was responsible for a great maritime crusade overseas with the banner of the I understand the Portuguese king offered succor to the Knights Templar and reformed them as the Knights of St. John, perhaps. Anyway, there's an argument that the lineage survived.
I'll have to claim ignorance on that subject, because there are so many lunatics obsessed with the subject of the Knights Templar that I always run and hide whenever the subject comes up.
Well, there's a Portuguese legend that the flags of that order were there for the Maritime Crusade, which then discovers the New World. Yes, I wanted to ask you about the relationship of England to wider Christendom, and specifically to the Holy Roman Emperor, who was obviously first in honorific precedence and Lord of the world temporally. And we have a letter from Henry II, Plantagenet, to Frederick I, in which he says that we are exposing our kingdom to you. The authority to govern will yield to you. There will be no willingness to not obey you. So that's, at least an indicator of a certain deference. And then
is that in the context of the Third Crusade, or is it because Henry II was going to go on the Third Crusade with Barbarossa, but he died before he could embark?
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. It's in a letter in Raedwick. It's in Bryce's history of the Holy Roman Empire.
Richard Lionheart, on his way back, when he was treacherously captured by Leopold of Austria because of a dispute during the capture of Acre. Leopold had raised his banner on top of the citadel, even though, as far as Richard was concerned, his lads had been doing most of the fighting. So he had it thrown down, and Leopold was furious and went off back to Austria. And then Richard was captured on the way back and held to ransom, and eventually, I think, handed over to the jurisdiction of Henry VI, the son of Barbarossa, who was then Holy Roman Emperor. And there was a ceremony which I think Bryce also describes, in which he surrendered the Kingdom of England to the Emperor and received it back from him as Lord of the World. I think it says in the record on it, and what that meant and symbolized is obscure. And I think 19th century historians were trying to argue that he was really doing fealty for some possessions that he had that were technically in the jurisdiction of the Kingdom of Eastern Francia, which is what the Holy Roman Empire kind of is. The term Holy Roman Empire is used in a very imprecise way about lots of different things, but I don't think there's any evidence for that. I mean, I think that's completely invented by upset nationalistic 19th century English historians. I think the actual evidence is that he was recognizing the subordination of England to the empire. There's some, but now I suppose that's obliterated by the concession of England to the Pope by John in is it 1213 when he does that? I'm trying to remember. By it becoming a papal fief, that sort of knocks it out of the jurisdiction of the emperor. So the question of what the jurisdiction of the emperor would have been had that not happened is an interesting one, and it's hard to pin down. Scottish notaries for a very long time carried on dating their documents by the regnal year of the Holy Roman Emperor. And of course, Scotland was never part of the classical Roman Empire at all. So clearly they had quite a high, but then of course the Scots often liked doing these kind of things in order to try and emphasize how they weren't recognizing the suzerainty of the English. So it's hard. Although of course, again, that is another, that attitude is a creation to some degree of the Scottish Wars of Independence, because Margaret and Malcolm were asserting really that in a certain sense Scotland was England. And of course, the name of Scotland in Gaelic is Alba, which means Albion. So the names and the lion on the Scottish royal arms is the Lion of Huntingdon, derived from David of Huntingdon, who was the junior line of the Anglo-Saxon and Scottish line after the loss of the senior line of Malcolm. But in fact, it represents part of England. It represents the fact that this chap is descended from the ancient pre-conquest English kings. Anyway, also I think the legend of Princess Scotia, which is the sort of Scottish origin myth, is hastily put together to replace the Geoffrey of Monmouth narrative in order to emphasize the difference of Scotland from England, again, in the course of the Scottish Wars of Independence. Yes, how did we get onto that? Sorry, I went completely down a rabbit hole about Scotland. We were talking about English involvement in the Crusades and Iberia. Yeah, I think one of the things about Iberia is the fact that, and also the jurisdiction of the Holy Roman Emperor. In Henry V, on the night before the Battle of Agincourt, when he's wandering around incognito, he's stopped by Pistol, and he says to Pistol, "Who goes there?" And Pistol says, "As good a man as the Emperor." And Henry V replies, "Well, then thou art a better than the king." Which is a striking thing to be said in a play written in the Elizabethan period. But some of the documents that Henry VIII put together in order to try and justify the break with Rome relied on this idea that the Kingdom of France was quasi-imperial and wasn't subject to the Holy Roman Emperor because of the fact that the French kings had an independent line of descent from Charlemagne. And Henry VIII was chancing the idea that he had an independent line of descent from Arthur, who, according to Mallory, had been crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome. Therefore, Bob's your uncle. The There's yes, the realm of England is immune from all foreign temporal and spiritual jurisdiction. But Henry VIII also said to Thomas More when he was writing in defense of the Seven Sacraments, he showed a late draft of it to Thomas More and asked him his opinion about what he said in it about the authority of the Pope. And Thomas More, who had been somewhat influenced by the ambient conciliarism of the period, he said that he thought that Henry VIII was over-egging it a bit in regard to the authority of the Pope, and that this was a hostage to fortune, because one day the Pope, who's a prince like other princes, would end up on the other side of some sort of European alliance to Henry VIII, and then the words that he put into this book would be thrown back in his face. And I believe what Henry VIII said, no, for from him we have our crown imperial, I think is what he said. We don't have any. More describes this in a letter to Thomas Cromwell, of all people, we don't have any elaboration of what he meant by that. Henry VIII recommended that More go away and read the epistles of Ignatius of Antioch in order to reassure himself that the papal primacy was a divine institution, which More did, and did assure himself that papal primacy was a divine institution, and consequently got killed as a result of being persuaded that it was a divine institution by Henry VIII. But there we are. But Henry VIII's comment in the thing about crown imperial, that I think that's his phrase he uses, but that implies that he thinks that the immunity of England from the jurisdiction of the Holy Roman Emperor is a result of the concession of England to the Pope by John, which I think is plausible.
I'd like to take up this theme of the Gregorian reforms and the story of St. Thomas of Becket, because I think that our perspective on the history of Christendom has tended to be somewhat coloured by a slightly clericalist reading in many cases. John Henry Newman wrote to Keble that the Becket papers might frighten people considerably on church and state. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about between regnum and sacerdotium in the High Middle Ages, about what the case of St. Thomas of Becket, and obviously a great saint, but the kind of problems that Henry II was dealing with separate ecclesiastical courts and the kind of abuses that were going on.
Well, I mean, the way both the Gregorian reformers and their opponents saw things was that there was a single community of Christendom / the church, which was one society in which there were temporal and spiritual powers, and the Ottonian emperors had not been disposed to draw a strong line. So this is the emperors from the 960s until the death of Saint Henry II in the 1020s, whatever it was, they'd not been disposed to draw a strong line between the spiritual and the temporal orders at all. And one of the problems of this is the extreme local character of power in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, i.e. Germany. And one of the ways in which the Ottonian emperors got around that was to give as much power as they could to the bishops, and who would be appointed by them, and couldn't have any legitimate heirs, and therefore that would mean that the emperors retained control of a huge chunk of to use a dangerous disputed word, feudal power in the Eastern Frankish kingdom. And the emperors were heavily involved. So, of course, in the 10th century, you have the absolute worst period in the history of the papacy, when you've got teenagers holding orgies in the Lateran Palace, who sitting on the throne of St. Peter, the worst part of that period goes up to 962, when the first Ottonian, Otto the Great, is crowned emperor by, in fact, one of these teenage popes, John the XII, and thereafter in general, the influence of the German kings is to restore order most of the time when they can, when they're in Italy with a big army. Otto III convinced himself that he could just act like a proper Roman emperor and live in Rome the whole time and hang out with his Byzantine fiancée and talk to his Byzantine mum, and that everything, not really appreciating that the power base of the Holy Roman Emperors was Germany. And so they just permanently moved to Italy. They would just end up being deposed as kings of Germany, and then lose their position in Italy as well. So it's intervention by the Salian Emperor Henry III, which eventually ends the debacle of the pontificate of Benedict IX, who reigns as Pope on 3 different occasions and sells the papacy on 1 occasion. And I think, according to some accounts, was 12 when he was elected Pope, but I think that's disputed. Some people think he might actually have been in his 20s, which is quite respectable for the period. But it's that's all brought to an end by Henry III, and Pope Leo IX founds what becomes known as the Gregorian Reform Movement, and it's known as the Gregorian Reform Movement because its greatest exponent was Hildebrand, who became Gregory VII, and he accompanied Leo IX down from the empire from Germany to Rome at the beginning of his pontificate, and he's very much the sort of background figure, inspiring and directing much of what happens thereafter until finally he is elected Pope himself. And there are some historians who would claim that this movement, one of the crucial things that William of Aquitaine does, who's the guy who founds the Duke of Aquitaine, who founds the monastery of Cluny in 910, which inspired this movement, is that he immunizes it from the jurisdiction of his own family. He says that its lay patronage is not to be exercised over Cluny. And it's also immunized from the jurisdiction of all bishops other than the Pope. And that allows Cluny to become this sort of ecclesiastical empire that establishes daughter houses all over the place and all ruled from the centre by the abbot of Cluny. And it's the first religious order really in the modern sense. But one of the things, and he just takes the title advocate of Cluny. William takes, and this is what's in the back of the mind of Godfrey of Bouillon at the end of the First Crusade, when he refuses to take the title King of Jerusalem and takes the title Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre instead. But some modern historians would claim that this begins to create a much more visceral separation between the clergy and the laity in Christendom, that it may have in some ways been necessary to get rid of the sort of robber baron politics of the papacy and the sort of Caesaro-papist constitution of the empire in Germany, but that it creates this opposition between the laity and the clergy, which eventually leads to this idea of using the word church to mean the clergy instead of using it to mean the faithful, which is what the term originally means and correctly means. I mean, it should be said in defense of the Gregorian reformers that they themselves did not think of they didn't seek to abolish the election of bishops by the lay faithful, for example. I mean, Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, who's the guy who laid the bull of excommunication on the altar of the Hagia Sophia in 1054. So he was a Gregorian red in tooth and claw. He was not he was no sort of compromise figure. He says quite explicitly that a valid episcopal election requires not only the assent of the clergy, but also the acclamation and acceptance of the people as well. And that was the ideal that was inspiring those chaps in Milan who Alexander II sent that red cross on a white background to in 1066. So I mean, it's nevertheless the way it turns out, especially, of course, beyond the Alps, where there was never really a popular role in episcopal elections anyway, because there wasn't an ancient urban culture of city-states in the way that there was in Italy. is a sort of segregation of a clerical self-perpetuating caste from a laity who lose their role. And in fact, even the Gregorian reformers didn't completely eliminate the role of the emperor in the appointment of the Pope. They didn't want the Pope to just be appointed by the emperor, but they didn't deny that were the emperor to veto a candidate while the election was still in progress, that would be a valid action on his part as the head of the Roman laity. So this now, and of course that was perpetuated in the later church history all the way down to the 20th century by the role of the civil authorities in nominating bishops. That was a sort of residuum of the old lay electoral role in episcopal elections. And the idea of the popes appointing bishops centrally as the normal way of episcopal appointment is completely novel. It's just crept up as a result of the fall of these concordatory arrangements. It just defaulted back to the popes, whereas strictly speaking, it should have defaulted back to the laity and the clergy of the diocese electing their own bishop. I think in the Novus Ordo rite of the consecration of a bishop, I think this is the consecration of a bishop to a vacant see. So when the guy who's there isn't actually it isn't already filled, although it may even be observed in the procedure for translating a bishop. What's called the Apostolic Mandate is read out, saying that he would rather like this chap to now become bishop of this diocese. And at the end, when it's read out, if you're at one of these events, there's a little thing at the end, and for the it's a little R to show that you're supposed to respond, and it says "Thanks be to God." And somewhere in incredibly tiny writing in the margins, it says that they thereby indicate their assent to the appointment of this person as the bishop. So
there's the lay acclamation.
That's right. It's like one of these insurance policies that people sign. They just lose the will to live after the first paragraph and just sign 8 pages without looking at it. So I mean, I think perhaps the Gregorian ideal, as the Gregorians themselves understood it, would not have involved this separation of the clergy and the laity into 2 separate castes. But I think that did actually happen. And I think part of the reason for that is because there wasn't an urban culture of popular election of bishops north of the Alps anyway. But I mean, the way they would have seen matters in regard to clerical exemptions and clerical property and clerical courts was that the clergy were like diplomatic personnel. To be a cleric was like having diplomatic plates on your car. And if you were a bad boy, that was a matter for the ambassador to deal with, not a matter for Somerset County Court or wherever it was he was speeding, or Crown Court, I suppose. And of course, this is wide open to abuse. But I mean, the practice of and the only way of ensuring that it isn't abused is to have the law vigorously enforced by canonical courts, or to surrender the clergy to the temporal jurisdiction. But I think for what it's worth, I think the Gregorian reformers are right, and that isn't the right solution. The immunity of the clergy should have been upheld, and in fact, Father Thomas and I say in our book that if there are particularly heinous crimes that perhaps would merit the death penalty, they should, such as famously heresy, they would. Then the proper procedure in Christendom was to laicise the person in question, surrender them to the temporal courts. Regardless of what one thinks about the death penalty, in terms of it not being a way of getting out of things, I don't know if you've ever looked into the history of benefit of clergy after the Reformation. It's quite amusing. It continued to be an institution in English law, and you could only use it once. I can't remember if they bore a hole in your earlobe or something. They did something pretty permanent to you to indicate that you'd used this and you weren't allowed to use it again. And it became completely detached from, and it was a way of not getting executed. And it became completely detached from the actual clergy. The courts apparently had centuries earlier used whether you were literate or not as a method of determining whether you were a cleric. And in order to, and they retained this in the post-Reformation period, even though obviously a vast proportion of the population who weren't clerics had long been literate, long before the Reformation. And so in order to, so if they were about to, that the judge is about to pick up his black handkerchief to put on the top of his wig in order to sentence you to death, and you were like, benefit of clergy, and you would then, they would give you a copy of the King James version, and they would turn it to the first verse of Psalm 50, what I can't remember the numberings in the Vulgate and the Hebrew, but anyway, the penitential psalm, and if you could say, "Have mercy on me, Lord, according to thy great mercy, and according to the multitude of thy mercies," however it goes. If you could say, I should have it memorized in case I end up in the 17th century by mistake. But so lots of people who were leading criminal lifestyles would memorize the first verse of Psalm 50 in order to avoid getting executed, so they could pretend to
very sneaky
and get their benefit of clergy. But there we are. Yes. So I think Becket died in a just cause. I don't think he's the martyr of clericalism. I think Henry II was in the wrong, and I think the fact that that the clergy were to subsequently abuse their position so dramatically, and no doubt were already attempting to do so at the time, doesn't change the principle of the case. Every form of power is abused. We just have to configure it in such a way as to minimize the chances of that happening.
Yes, and that great configuration was happening in the 13th century with the development of the fontal institutions, the law, the crown, parliament, the temporal institutions, and obviously Magna Carta, which makes national taxation subject to assembly consent, and the instantiation of liberty within the bounds of law, and to the point that by the 15th century, the constitutional writer Sir John Fortescue remarks that England was ruled by dominium politicum et regale, public and royal lordship, as opposed to France, for example, being governed only by dominium regale, royal lordship. Yes, so could you perhaps remark on the development of the English constitution here and this Aristotelian mixed regime?
Yes, it's very interesting. I mean, of course, it's a great mystery exactly how that happened. I mean, it seems that Justinian's code was not widely disseminated in the West in the 6th century. And so people's knowledge of what Roman law was during the Dark Ages, meaning in not medieval Christendom but the period before
the early Middle Ages.
Yes, yeah, was very limited, and probably mostly derived from the relevant chapter of Isidore of Seville's Etymologies, which is a sort of hitchhiker's guide to the Dark Ages. It was the words "Don't panic" written in big friendly letters on the front cover, and it's and he has a chapter. One of the books of the Etymologies is on law, and it's largely based on Gaius's institutes, which precede Justinian's codification by a number of centuries. Now in Justinian's code, in his institutes, so there's 4 books. When Justinian codified Roman law, there are 4 elements to it. One is the code itself. The other is the novels, which is the stuff that was added afterwards in Greek. And there's the institutes, which is the sort of textbook of legal theory, and then there's the digest, which is a condensed summary of the opinions of the great Roman jurists. And the institutes is in many ways word for word identical to earlier versions of earlier textbooks on Roman law by Ulpian and Gaius. And but one of the areas which diverges is this thing called the Lex Regia. It gives a list of the origins of different forms of law, being plebiscites and edicts by magistrates and edicts by the Senate, and leges, properly speaking, which are enacted by the Senate and the Roman people together. And these are all the traditional sources of Roman law, and it seems that originally, when the emperors legislated in the imperial period, which is what we call it, I mean, they didn't call it that, but I mean, in the Principate, from Augustus to Diocletian, they would legislate. What they were technically doing was issuing an edict as a magistrate, which was like a declaration as to how they interpreted the law. It wasn't original legislation. The original legislation remained in the power of the Senate and the people. Now, the assemblies of the people never met after the death of Augustus. He is supposed to have advised Tiberius to get rid of it. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but Tiberius did get rid of it in 14 AD, with one exception, that the assembly of the people would meet at the beginning of each imperial reign, at least until the 3rd century, and they would pass this thing called the Lex de Imperio, which would give the person who was being made emperor the right to dispose of all the powers of the Republic for the duration of his life. And that was the legal basis of the authority of the Roman emperors. And that sort of fell out in the 3rd century, largely because the 3rd century was chaos. And most of the emperors who didn't reign for very long, they were constantly being murdered and replaced. And they spent their reigns at the frontier, desperately trying to keep out the barbarians and the Persians, or trying to murder each other. And so the Lex de Imperio sort of fell out of use. And then Diocletian, when he sort of restores order to the Roman Empire at the end of the 3rd century, he tries to have this kind of sort of James VI view of the origin of, well, not quite, but I mean, he has this idea that sort of he is the living embodiment of Jupiter, and his pal Maximian, who he appoints as his co-emperor, is the living embodiment of Hercules, and they're going to appoint heirs to themselves, a Heraclean and a Jovian line, and there will just be and Diocletian makes a big point of never even going to visit Rome, so the Senate doesn't even have the option of confirming his acclamation by the troops. The acclamation by the troops isn't seen as sort of military coup, because the troops are seen as sort of representative body of the Roman citizenry. So it's seen as a sort of legal procedure, the acclamation by the Roman army. It's not seen as a sort of dodgy thing. In fact, the elections of in the Roman Republic would take place on the Field of Mars, which was the parade ground for the ancient Republican Roman armies. So he tries to create a sort of and he says everyone has to call him Dominus now and prostrate themselves in front of him. And Lactantius gets very upset about this and says that anyone who does this is an apostate from the Christian faith. So he tries to phase out completely any residual element of republicanism in the Roman constitution. And even though what he's trying to do, ironically, is very sort of objective and bureaucratic, he tries to construct a system of automatic succession of nominated emperors. So he's not trying to introduce a hereditary system. It's more like the People's Republic of China. Anyway, but this is destroyed by the acclamation of Constantine as emperor in York in 306, because that is from on the basis of Diocletian's new ideology. That's an illegal usurpation of the empire. But Constantine is such a terrifying figure that they're too frightened to sort of push him out, and so he immediately takes control of the quarter of the empire that his father was previously ruling.
Site of York Minster.
Absolutely, that's right. Yeah, on the very spot. And did we? I don't know if we mentioned last time. It's very interesting that Leo XIII, in his encyclical Annum Sacrum, which is about the about the consecration of the human race to the Sacred Heart. He talks about the hope of a restored Christendom, and he talks about Constantine's vision of the cross in the sky, and how we looked for a restored Christendom. We look to the cross that rises from the Sacred Heart amidst flames of love, another devotion which originated in England, just saying, or at least partly originated in England. But it's funny, because if you go to York Minster, you'll see the west window, the great west window of York Minster, is of the Sacred Heart. I mean, the locals don't get it anymore because they've been separated from Holy Mother Church for so long. But you'll see there's all the tracery is of a massive heart that fills the entire window with a flame rising out of the centre of it. And that's on the spot where Constantine was acclaimed emperor, which I think is quite exciting. But anyway, there we are. So the Constantinople, which of course Constantine founds, becomes sort of revives in a way the republicanism of the Roman Empire, oddly, because it's such an impregnable location that in order for someone to successfully establish themselves as the Roman Emperor in Constantinople, they need the tacit consent of the civilian population. And so the ritual of coronation of the Christian emperors becomes the restored version of the old Lex de Imperio. So it may be this that Justinian is referring to in this famous passage, the Lex Regia, in the Institutes, but which isn't in the etymologies, Isidore of Seville, because he's drawing on earlier texts which don't acknowledge a legislative power innate to the imperial office. But in this passage, Justinian says, the pleasure of the emperor has the vigor and the effect of law, since the Roman people by the royal law have bestowed upon him the full extent of their own power and sovereignty. Right now, it may be that this in Justinian is simply describing the acclamation of an emperor, that's what's happening legally, and in that regard, he's equating the acclamation of the emperor to the old Lex de Imperio from before the 3rd century. But once Roman law was rediscovered in 11th century Latin Christendom, this slowly began to ground. It was misunderstood essentially as a passage, and it's probably the misunderstanding of that passage is the remote origin of the contractualist theory of the origin of political legitimacy, of the idea that the people qua atomized individual autonomous wills that exist only in the fevered dreams of William of Ockham, they then bestow their power on the Leviathan, and he is then unrestrainable. And that is not what Justinian meant. And that error begins to, particularly from the 14th century, once nominalism established itself, begins to permeate continental legal systems. And in the meantime, Roman law, because the Justinianic codification is so unbelievably convenient and impressive, it takes over continental legal systems quite rapidly from the late 11th century onwards. And England alone resists and retains its old legal system, which would just be a peculiarity were it not for the fact the British Empire has spread this across a quarter of the globe, so that we now ended up being only slightly less widespread legal system than the one that arose out of the Justinianic codification's rediscovery in the 11th century. So they've become the two main rival legal systems. But the English were not attempting to create a non-Roman legal system in the meantime. I mean, Bede tells us that when Ethelbert of Kent was baptized, he began legislating in the Roman fashion, he says. But as they didn't have any actual material content to that Roman fashion, it means that they were, I take it, I mean, this is a hugely contentious subject, which I'm not at all qualified to talk, but anyway, there we are, go ahead. That he was legislating in the manner that he imagined a Roman would legislate. And the way in which an Anglo-Saxon king would imagine a Roman would legislate would be based on the theory of Roman law, which is contained in Isidore of Seville's transcription of Gaius, which is very much the same as the theory of Roman law contained in Justinian's Institutes, but it does crucially lack this subsequently misunderstood passage about the Lex Regia. So I think the resist. So one of the key elements of the emergence of this dominium politicum et regale in England is this immunity that the English polity manages to develop to colonization by pastiche Justinian, which everybody else falls victim to. Another element which is tremendously important, which is certainly derived from the Normans, because I mean feudalism is feudalism, and feudalism is a continental European phenomenon originally that arises out of the collapse of Charlemagne's empire, which of course is not something which occurs in England. The English polity remains coherent and stable throughout the period that continental Europe is falling into total anarchy in the 10th century. But the feudal idea is imported into England by the conqueror, who, as we've discussed, is not nostalgic and squeamish about trampling everything in his path. But one of the key elements of that is the very personal nature of political authority. That at the bottom of in a way, what the best description of feudalism is the opening scene of The Godfather. Where the undertaker complains that he relied on the objective state instead of his personal relationship with Don Corleone, and it's led to his daughter being beaten to half to death, and the culprit's being given a suspended sentence, and now he's going back to feudalism, and could his feudal liege Don Corleone please sort it out for him. Really, it is a very dramatic description of it. But when you have a collapse of the objective legal order in that way, then you very often end up with a mafia style situation in which essentially the person in your actual vicinity who is actually capable of using force in such a fashion as to protect you from the other people who would like to use force against you, you will, either because he demands it or because you offer, because you need someone to protect you, you will give him your agricultural produce in exchange for his protection. And he will have to federate with other hard men from adjacent areas in order to make sure that other federations of hard men do not come and wipe out his territory and replace it and make it their territory instead. So this pyramid of military obligation and protection with an agrarian base is a sort of automatic sort of emergency human political society structure that arises, but because the way that has to work is characterized by the feudal superior taking the advice and counsel of those below him and them respectfully accepting his advice and counsel, and in exchange he provides aid to them when they need it, and they muster at his command when he needs their force to ensure his continued control over the territory that he controls. And that is that relationship is very important, and it's the relationship which John was seen to violate, that he was acting capriciously and indifferently to the interests and counsel of those below him, and when he's forced to terms with the assistance of Innocent III, interdict, because Innocent III, there's a dispute over the succession to the dispute over the succession to Canterbury. The canons elect one chap and John wants somebody else, and they both appeal to Innocent III, and the canons candidate dies, but the canons send a subgroup of them of their own number to Rome for the sake of the appeal, who they give plenitude of jurisdiction to. So when they get there, Innocent gets them to elect Stephen Langton, in his presence, and John is furious and refuses to accept it. And this eventually leads to the whole of England being placed under an interdict for a number of years, during which John is supposed to have considered converting to Islam, and I don't think I would have got away with that. But that's what triggers the surrender of England to the Pope, which Henry VIII was alluding to in his conversation with Thomas More, and it triggers an attempted French invasion and a revolt of the barons, and who have their own grievances, not least the loss of all their possessions in Normandy through John's incompetence, and that eventually leads to the Great Charter of Liberties, one of whose many requirements is that no taxation be imposed upon the whole realm without the council of the whole realm. And it uses these terms aid and council, which are central to the feudal relationship. And then over the course of the rest of the 13th century, mechanisms are slowly developed at the cost of a number of bloody civil wars, to for the realm to give that aid and council. Sorry, to give that aid. Give that council as the cost of the aid to the crown, and of course the most famous expression of that is the Parliament, the institution of Parliament created by Simon de Montfort in the late 1250s and the first half of the 1260s, and I mean, it's tantalising. We don't know exactly where the idea for this structure came from. What's called the first English Parliament is held in Blackfriars, Oxford, not the present building, but spiritually. And Simon de Montfort, of course, his father, the older Simon de Montfort, had been the commander of the Albigensian Crusade and a personal friend and companion of Saint Dominic. And so there's tantalising circumstantial evidence that the structure of the English constitution is derived, the structure of Parliament is derived from the Dominican constitutions, because one of the problems that Cluny presented was that it had the same problem in the governments of its daughter houses that the Roman Republic had, which is that, okay, great, everyone's a citizen of the Roman Republic, but unless you're actually there on the field of Mars on the day the elections happen, then that doesn't provide you with any actual influence. And the first people to try and get round that, the fact that the Cluny might turn all these other monasteries into priories of Cluny, but if they're in Prussia or Calabria or Asturias, then they're not going to be able to vote. So one of the first attempts to get around that is invented by the Cistercians, also by an Englishman, in fact, St. Stephen Harding, the Carta Caritatis, the Charter of Charity, which is designed to govern the Cistercian order. And the way it works is there's a general chapter of all the abbots. Every Cistercian house is an abbey, unlike in the Cluniac system, where the subordinate houses are priories, whose priors are appointed by the abbot of Cluny. In the Cistercian system, every Cistercian house is an abbey, and those abbots together, as a general chapter, constitute the sovereign body of the Cistercian order. But St. Dominic goes...
They're aristocratic as opposed to monarchical Cluniac government.
Yeah, I suppose that's true. Yeah. So, well, Cluniac is a kind of Napoleonic populist monarchy, whereas Citeaux is sort of aristocratic, although each of the aristocrats is a populist monarch of his own, I suppose. And then Saint Dominic adds to this. And of course, by this point, the locus of belonging in the Dominican structure is the order itself, not the particular abbey anyway, so it's particularly important. So he has this system where the priors are elected by their own subjects in each priory, and then when they gather in a province to elect their prior provincial to govern a province of the Dominican order, they are accompanied by definitors who are elected, 2 definitors from each house, who are elected only by those who are subject to the priors. So they don't have any executive powers at all. They're only there to represent, and then that structure is replicated for the order as a whole. So each province elects 2 definitors, and sends its prior provincial to the Dominican General Chapter. And the Dominican General Chapter takes 2 different forms. One is the chapter of priors, and one is the chapter of definitors. And in order for a legislative act to pass, it has to be agreed 3 times by both chapters. And then, of course, they in turn elect the Master General of the Order, who is the executive branch for the Dominican Order as a whole. And St. Dominic respected this structure. I mean, he for example, wanted to have, probably very sensibly, only lay brothers be eligible to be elected superiors of houses, in order to make sure the clerical brethren didn't get too overexcited. But the clerical brethren voted that down in General Chapter, and so it never happened to this day. Hasn't happened. So the fact that Simon de Montfort, the son of the man who was there with St. Dominic in the Languedoc at the beginning of the Dominican Order, while they were singing Stephen Langton's Veni Sancti Spiritus as they went into battle, we know from contemporary descriptions, that his son should have been the centre of the revolt against King John's son, in which they tried to enforce on him the structures which Magna Carta demanded, and they tried to create those structures. And the first time that they made the attempt was in Blackfriars, Oxford, and the next time in 1264, I think, was in Westminster, and on that occasion, for the first time, de Montfort asked every shire and borough to elect 2 representatives to sit alongside the Lords. I don't think they actually sat as physically separate gatherings for some time after that. But crucially, at the end of the century, Edward I, who was the person who finally defeated Simon de Montfort when he was still just the heir to the throne, he decides that actually de Montfort's structures are rather clever, and he's going to keep them. So he summons the model parliament. Whereas Louis IX, who was asked to intervene between de Montfort and Henry III, sorry, to de Montfort's great disappointment, decided that it was too much. He didn't put it this way, but he created 2 Hanoverian structure in which the throne was essentially reduced to a decorative function, and its powers were exercised by a committee of the Parliament. That was more or less. That's perhaps in his frustration. That's where de Montfort had gone with that in the end. I mean, de Montfort's a very difficult figure. I mean, there were miracles reported at his tomb after he died, and he didn't really. His body was horribly dismembered, but there were miracles reported, and he had a cause for his canonization, which never got anywhere. But probably because it was politically unacceptable. I mean, who knows where it might have got. But anyway, So de Montfort's settlement is rejected by Louis IX, and eventually de Montfort is defeated and killed at the Battle of Evesham, yes, in horrible circumstances. But his institution is retained by the man who defeated him, Prince Edward, who becomes Edward I. And so he quotes Roman law in the bull of the writ of summons for the model parliament, that which touches on all should be agreed to by all. But it's actually, in its original context, the passage refers to, I think, to do with changing the terms of contracts by mutual consent later on. So it has no public law connotations at all, I think. So it's kind of a decorative use of Roman law in the writ of summons for the model parliament. So that century, the greatest of centuries, as someone once said, gives us the fundamental institutions of the kingdom, which I think are, in some ways, are. I mean, you could put together an argument they're more Roman than the continental civilian structures, because they represent a more true insight into the genius of the Roman Republican political tradition than pastiche Justinian was delivering for our continental cousins.
Yes, and this is genius that is recognised and admired by someone like Joseph de Maistre, who said that the English constitution was the most complex unity and the most propitious equilibrium of political powers that the world has ever seen. And then went on to say that it follows that the spirit was guided, they were guided in their course by an infallible power. So I think that fruit of the faith we're in the temple arena, and indeed my friend, the Spanish jurist, Professor Miguel Ayuso Torres, makes the point that, well, despite the emptying of the substance of the medieval political forms, their survival to this day lies in that precious gift of stability, which permits men to order their future and that of their families in accord with eternal laws. So I think maybe that's a nice note in which to close this broadcast, and perhaps to have a future episode on the sad decay of the Middle Ages and the scandal of the war between the baptized, of the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses and so on, and all the way to the disaster of Henry VIII.
Sounds good.